They said his idea was a fool's errand, a ditch that would break ankles and flood his cabin. But according to the Wyoming Territorial Archives, that useless ditch became the basis for a frontier building code that saved thousands of homes from ruin. By the end of this story, you will discover 3 shocking truths that changed how pioneers built their lives in the American West. Before we reveal how this one man's stubbornness changed everything, you need to understand the catastrophic failure that forced his hand. Elias Thorne knelt in the cold Wyoming mud of early autumn, 1877. He had to understand why the Miller family's cabin had collapsed just after dawn. Every single log touching the earth was rotted to pulp, as soft as wet bread. His own cabin, built the exact same way just 50 yards uphill, faced the same fate. If he could not find a solution before the first snows, his own family would be homeless. Silas Blackwood, the settlement's unofficial leader, stood over him with his arms crossed. Silas had built half the cabins in this valley, and his voice carried the weight of experience. He kicked at a piece of the ruined foundation. The wood disintegrated. According to wilderness survival expert Dr. Evelyn Reed, a historian specializing in frontier construction, this type of failure was tragically common. Dr. Reed states, settlers brought carpentry skills, but they were often unprepared for the unique hydrological challenges of mountain environments. The ground itself was their greatest enemy. Silas grunted. Wood rots, Thorne. It is the price we pay for living here. Best you can do is build on higher ground and hope for 5 good years. You have to accept it. But Elias, a carpenter by trade from Pennsylvania, could not accept it. He had chosen these logs himself, straight and solid lodgepole pine. The Miller's land deed, stamped by the Wyoming Land Office, was only 3 years old. Wood like this should not fail in 3 years. It was not just a loss, it was a flaw in the fundamental design of their survival. Have you ever seen something you trusted fail completely? It is a feeling that shakes you to your core. Elias felt that shake right down to his bones. What Silas called acceptance, Elias saw as a surrender. He ran his hand over the pulpy wood, then pressed his fingers into the dark, saturated soil beneath it. The ground was not just damp, it was a permanent sponge. That night he couldn't sleep. The image of the Miller family huddled in a neighbor's cabin with all their possessions stacked outside haunted him. He knew that could be his wife Sarah and their young son Jacob. Stay with me. What happens next is the first critical turning point. He realized Silas was not just wrong, he was dangerously wrong. The next morning, Elias took his journal and began walking. He was not looking for new timber. He was looking for ghosts. Over the next 2 weeks, he found 6 abandoned cabins within a 10-mile radius of the settlement. These were structures documented in the Sweetwater County Settlement Ledger, which showed entries for families who had given up and moved on. Each cabin told the same story. The walls above were often sound, but the foundation logs were destroyed. The rot always began where wood met earth, and it was always worst at the downhill-facing doorway. National Park Service historical data confirms this pattern. Their surveys of 19th century structures show that over 70% of foundation failures originated at the primary entrance, due to concentrated water runoff and foot traffic. Elias sketched each site in his journal, noting the slope of the land and the direction of water flow. The evidence became undeniable. The cabins were not simply rotting, they were being systematically dissolved from the ground up. His search led him to the old McGregor place, abandoned for at least a decade. The cabin had long since collapsed into a pile of decaying logs. A crate nearby, its wood mostly gone, still bore a faint mark from the Union Pacific Railroad, a reminder of the supplies that once sustained a family's hope. Here the pattern was most clear. The ground where the threshold had been was a shallow depression, a natural basin for every drop of rain that ran down the small hill. The real story was just beginning to unfold. He knelt in the damp earth, the same way he had at the Miller cabin. He realized everyone was focused on the wood, trying to find better logs or seal them with tar that always cracked in the winter freeze. They were all trying to armor the victim. No one was trying to stop the attacker. The attacker was not the rain, it was the ground the rain soaked. What would you do in this situation? Would you have the endurance to challenge decades of accepted wisdom? Elias later described the moment as a profound shift in his thinking. He wrote in his journal, "We have been building boats to survive a flood, when what we need is a canal to guide the water away." This was the first shocking truth that rocked the settlement. The problem was not bad wood, it was bad drainage. The solution, he decided, was not to build a better wall, but to dig a better ditch. He would create a shallow, stone-lined trench directly in front of his threshold, a miniature channel designed to catch water running downhill and divert it safely away from the cabin's foundation. When Silas Blackwood saw Elias marking out a line in the dirt with a piece of string, he laughed out loud. "You are going to put a pit where you walk every day, Thorne. My boy Jacob will break his ankle in that thing before the week is out." The whole settlement treated it as a fool's errand. The official incident report for the Miller cabin, filed with the territorial marshal, simply stated, "Structural failure due to natural decay." That was the end of the story for everyone else. For Elias, it was the beginning. He ignored the whispers and the headshakes. He knew what he had seen in those abandoned cabins. He trusted the evidence of his own eyes over the weight of tradition. Sarah stood by him, bringing him water as he dug. She told him later, "I did not understand the idea, but I understood the look on your face. You had found an answer." The work was brutal. The trench was to be 4 feet long, 8 inches wide, and 7 inches deep, just enough to handle a heavy downpour without overflowing. For 4 days, he dug into the compacted, rocky soil. His shovel handle, its wood stamped with a maker's mark from a tool company in Ohio, cracked on the second day. He spent half a day carving a new one. By the end, his hands were a mess of blisters and cuts. Then came the stones. For 3 more days, he walked the creek bed, gathering flat, heavy stones to line the channel. Each trip was a quarter-mile each way. He was building more than a trench. He was building a testament to his conviction. Little did he know, a storm was brewing that would test his theory in the most devastating way possible. The first test came as a gentle autumn rain. Elias and Sarah stood in the doorway, watching as runoff flowed down the hill. Instead of pooling against their threshold log, the water fell into the trench. It flowed along the slight gradient he had built into the channel and drained harmlessly away down the slope. It worked. The ground next to their foundation stayed merely damp, not saturated. Anyone who has been lost in the wilderness knows the unique fear of being at the mercy of the elements. For the first time in months, Elias felt a sense of control, but he knew this was a small victory. The real challenge would be the spring thaw or a multi-day storm. You need to hear what happens next. It will change how you see wilderness survival. A week later, the sky turned a bruised purple and the heavens opened. For 3 straight days, rain fell in unrelenting sheets. The settlement turned into a swamp. Creeks overflowed. The ground became so saturated it could not absorb another drop. This was the kind of event that the Territorial Weather Service archives for 1877 later called a 50-year flood. On the 3rd morning, the predictable tragedies began. The widow Jensen's cabin, built in a low-lying area, took on 6 inches of water. Her floor was ruined. Then a runner arrived with worse news. Silas Blackwood's cabin, the model of traditional construction, was flooding. The water, with nowhere else to go, had overwhelmed his threshold and was pouring inside. Silas, his wife, and his children were frantically bailing with buckets. Elias walked to his own doorway. Water poured through his trench in a steady, controlled stream. The channel was nearly full, but it was not overflowing. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Inside his cabin, the floor was bone dry. The threshold log was wet on its surface, but the ground beneath it was solid. He stood there watching the controlled flow of his simple invention, and then looked across the muddy expanse at the chaos engulfing his neighbors. What he found next would change everything for the entire community. He saw Silas, soaked and defeated, look over at his cabin, at the impossibly dry ground around his door. The mockery was gone from the man's face, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. This was the second shocking truth. Elias's useless trench had not just worked, it had triumphed where every other method had failed catastrophically. The flood broke the back of the settlement's stubborn traditions. When the rain finally stopped, the valley was a scene of devastation. Food supplies were ruined. 2 cabins, including the one belonging to the young Finnerty family, had suffered partial foundation collapses. Their building permit, issued just 2 years prior, was now a tragic reminder of false security. But the Thorne cabin stood untouched. That evening, a figure appeared out of the twilight, walking slowly through the mud. It was Silas Blackwood. He stopped before Elias's trench, staring at the stone-lined channel as if it were a miracle. He did not say anything for a long time. Finally, he looked at Elias. His pride was shattered, but his honesty remained. "I was wrong, Thorne. I was wrong, and you were right." He gestured at the trench. "Would you show me how to build one?" That single question was more powerful than any flood. It was an admission that the old ways were broken. According to Elias's own journal, this was the moment he felt the most relief. He wrote, "It was not about being right, it was about all of us being safe." Over the next month, Elias did not just help Silas. He supervised the construction of 3 more trenches for families whose homes had been damaged. He did not ask for payment. His reward was the quiet sound of shovels and the sight of men carefully laying stones, building a shared future. The community, once united in skepticism, was now united in renewal. Remember that settlement ledger I mentioned? A new entry appeared in 1878, noting that 4 cabins had installed Thorne-style drainage trenches. The name had stuck. If this shocks you, hit like to help spread awareness about how simple innovations can have a massive impact. Has wilderness survival affected someone you know? Share your story in the comments. The truth was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Elias's simple idea was about to go far beyond their small valley. Years passed. The settlement recovered and grew. Every new cabin was built with what was now simply called a threshold trench. The practice became so ingrained that newcomers were taught it as a fundamental rule of mountain construction. The original problem of rotting foundations faded from memory, replaced by a new standard of permanence. In the spring of 1885, a man named Callum MacLeod, a surveyor with the United States Geological Survey, passed through the valley while mapping the region. His field notes, which are now part of the public record, describe his surprise at the unique construction. He had surveyed hundreds of settlements across the West and had never seen anything like it. He spent an afternoon with Elias, now a respected elder in the community. Elias, with his characteristic humility, explained the simple principles: depth for volume, stones for stability, and a slope for drainage. MacLeod sketched the design in his official logbook, case file GS 1885 by BY 34. He labeled it the Thorne Trench, an effective method for preserving cabin foundations in high-moisture environments. That surveyor's report was the spark that lit a fire. The design was included in a government pamphlet for homesteaders published the following year. Builders and settlers, desperate for any advantage against the harsh elements, adopted it quickly. From the Rockies of Colorado to the Cascades of Oregon, the simple stone-lined ditch became a quiet revolution. What do you think will happen to a simple idea when it is shared with the world? Drop your prediction below. Elias never sought fame or fortune from his invention. His satisfaction came from seeing the cabins in his valley stand strong, year after year, decade after decade. He watched children who had been born in those cabins grow up and start families of their own, in homes their parents had built to last. The trench had given them more than dry floors. It had given them stability, the one thing the frontier so often denied. This was the third and most explosive truth. One man's solution, born of desperation and careful observation, became the anonymous, common-sense wisdom of a generation. Decades later, in the summer of 1906, Elias Thorne was an old man. His hands were gnarled and his face was a map of long winters and bright summers. He sat on the porch of the same cabin he had built nearly 30 years before. The original threshold logs, the same ones he had laid in 1877, were still solid beneath his feet. A young architect from Cheyenne, working on a historical preservation project, had come to see the original Thorne Trench. He knelt and examined the smooth, water-worn stones. He ran his hand along the weathered but unrotted threshold log. "This is remarkable," he said. "This one simple idea probably prevented thousands of structural failures. It should be in every engineering textbook." Elias just smiled. "It is not about engineering," he said softly. "It is about watching the water." He looked out at the valley, at the sturdy homes that dotted the landscape, each one protected by a small, unassuming ditch. He had not set out to change the world. He had only wanted to protect his family. Yet in solving his own problem with clear eyes and a stubborn refusal to accept failure, he had given a gift to countless others. The rain began to fall, a gentle summer shower. Water trickled down the hillside, flowed into the ancient trench, and drained away, just as it had for 30 years. The quiet sound was a promise kept. Share this with someone who loves the outdoors. The greatest survival tools are not always an axe or a rifle. Sometimes they are patience, observation, and the courage to dig a simple trench when everyone else is telling you it is useless. Subscribe for more real survival stories like this. Endurance matters.